Amazing. This is like entering a lecture hall. Fantastic seeing so many people joining us today. A very, very warm welcome from New York City. My name is Catherine DiPaola. I'm the program manager here at the German Center for Research and Innovation. I'm here with Julia. Julia, can you wave so people see you? Thank you very much. And we are very, very excited to co-host an event tonight with our wonderful supporter, the University of Hamburg. And we have Jan Frömming representing Hamburg here. Jan, if you could wave. That would be great. There's Jan. On a very, very important topic, which is the fight for climate justice. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great seeing you. If you feel comfortable, please turn on your camera so that we actually have the feeling of being in a lecture hall and not sitting in front of a black screen. That would be lovely. And I want to tell you 2 sentences about what we do here at the German Center for Research and Innovation. We're one of 5 houses globally. We have one in Tokyo, one in Sao Paulo in Brazil, we have one in Moscow, one in New Delhi, and who am I forgetting now? I'm not sure. We're here in New York, and we're going to open another one in San Francisco as well. And we're basically here as a platform to show what's happening in the respective countries in research and innovation. And today I'm super thrilled to have a fantastic panel here. Thank you again to Jan, and then also to Anita from the University of Hamburg, to bringing 2 more colleagues from Northwestern University, Reynaldo and Kim, to the table to discuss the fight for climate justice. I think a topic that's not only of importance since COP26, but it has been important before, and it will be even more important every single day from now on. My role here is basically to give you a little introduction to the tech that we're working with. You're in a WebEx environment, and I'm not sure how many WebEx meetings you've had in the past, but I want to make your experience a little bit more pleasant. So if you go on your screen to the left upper corner, you see the word view. And if you click on view and you go all the way to the bottom, you see themes. And if you click on themes, you can change the background to a dark mode, which is a little bit more pleasing to the eye, I would say, but that's completely up to you. At the bottom of your screen, you have a little icon, like a little smiley face that says reactions. This is a wonderful tool, and we encourage you to use it all the time throughout the presentation, because this gives direct feedback to our panelists. Whether you love the idea, if you say this is great, this is fantastic, or sometimes it's also no, I disagree, and you can have an instant feedback there. So please make use of that as well. Of course, you can change your layout. If you hover a little bit and you go to the top again, towards the right, you see layout, and then you can customize whatever you would like to see. I think this is it in terms of tech. We're also recording the session, so if you don't want to be seen, of course, you may turn off your camera. Also, we would love to ask you to be muted until we go to the Q&A session, just for background noises. And actually, I have drilling in the background right now, so I'm going to go to mute in a second. But just let you know, we have a greeting. That's how we start, from Consul General Akins, who's joining us from Hamburg. Welcome to you as well, and thank you for being with us. And then we have a presentation by the panelists, and afterwards, ample of time for Q&A. 2 ways of engaging. You can either type your question in the chat if you like, or you type a cue, and I try and identify all the cues, and then I will call on you. You can turn on your camera and your sound, and you can ask the question in person. And with that, my 2.5, 3 minutes are up. Consul Akins, it's wonderful having you here, and please, the floor is yours to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. DiPaola, for the kind introduction. Dear Dr. Engels, dear Dr. Suiseeya, dear Dr. Morales, sehr geehrte Herr Frömming, and dear Dr. DiPaola, and dear guests, welcome to this event, and thank you for joining and participating. The fight for climate justice is our shared fight. It takes all of us, federal, state, and local governments, tribal nations, and nations around the world, universities, NGOs, civil society, and the private sector, to address the climate and environmental challenges we are facing. It is also intergenerational, with young people around the world raising their voices for climate action with urgency and determination. None of us can opt out. We must act together, because we cannot win this fight alone. Not only our histories are inextricably intertwined, our future is as well. I preface my welcome remarks with the call for collective action, because I think today's event showcases this collaborative approach to the challenges that we are facing. It brings together experts from Northwestern University and Universität Hamburg and even more institutions. Universität Hamburg, the cluster of excellent climatic change and society, Northwestern University, the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York, and the U.S. Consulate General Hamburg have jointly organized this transatlantic exchange of ideas, strategies, and best practices out of a shared commitment to fight climate injustice and create sustainable future for all. Knowledge exchange, like today's between academic experts, is key to tackling global crises. We become smarter as a result. We become more resourceful, effective, successful in confronting global challenges. Universities play a key role in this process. The same is true for cities, themselves important actors in the fight against the impact of climate change. Chicago and Hamburg have been sister cities for 27 years, maintaining several exchanges that foster mutual understanding. Today's event strengthens the robust transatlantic exchange that spans institutions, cities, and communities. I am grateful to the participating institutions and individuals, especially to our panelists, for coordinating across 3 time zones and very busy schedules. I would also like to thank in particular Mr. Froming from the International Office of Universität Hamburg for inviting us to join this event. 3 weeks after the UN Climate Change Conference concluded, this event is both important and timely. It offers the opportunity for a COP26 readout and for exploring new possibilities in the fight for climate justice. Achieving environmental justice is central to the Biden administration. We know, to quote Vice President Harris, that we cannot achieve health justice, economic justice, racial justice, or educational justice without environmental justice. We are talking about human rights. Environmental justice is inseparable from social justice. It is central to the administration's fight against inequity, systematic racism, and the disparities that exist in indigenous and marginalized communities across our nations, the communities that are disproportionately affected by the impact of the climate crisis. U.S. Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, the first Native American cabinet secretary, has addressed the impact of the dual crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss on indigenous communities. At a virtual discussion with indigenous youth from across the globe at the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, she highlighted 2 issues that I think are particularly relevant for today's discussion: the centrality of indigenous knowledge and youth in tackling the climate emergency. Quote, "Science includes indigenous knowledge. Our bold action to address the climate crisis is rooted in indigenous knowledge and the voices of indigenous youth." End quote. So I am looking forward to learning about and from the panelists' perspectives on these topics. I now have the great honor to introduce the distinguished panelist. Admittedly, this is a daunting and humbling task for a diplomat. I hope you will forgive me for the abbreviated version of their impressive CVs with the long list of publications, honors, awards, and service contributions. I will limit the introduction to the scholars' titles and affiliations so that we will have time for presentations and the discussions with you. First, Dr. Anita Engels is a professor for sociology at the Universität Hamburg. She is a member of the Center for Sustainable Society Research and co-chair of the Cluster of Excellence, Climate, Climatic Change, and Society. Second, Dr. Kimberly Suiseeya is an assistant professor in the Political Science Department and the Environmental Policy and Culture program at Northwestern University. She is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and of the Institute for Policy Research. In addition, Dr. Suiseeya co-leads the Buffett Institute Working Group on the disproportionate effects of environmental change. Third, Dr. Reynaldo Morales is an assistant professor at Medill School of Journalism and Media and the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. He is also a faculty affiliate at the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and the Center for Latinx Media. Dr. Engels, Dr. Suiseeya, Dr. Morales, thank you for sharing with us your expertise and perspectives tonight. I'm looking forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Consul Akins. I hope you can all understand me well. Good evening to the guests. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. Climate change is often understood as a technological problem. Too much CO2 in the atmosphere, let's fix it by switching to technologies that avoid CO2 or just switch the energy system. This is, of course, not entirely wrong, but it is also a misleading view in one sense. And tonight we want to point out an alternative view. We think that the real problem behind anthropogenic climate change and also other environmental problems like biodiversity loss, the real problem lies in the current structures of power and domination that allow again and again to produce wealth in a very selective way, in a way that systematically creates harm, in a way that allows the well-being of some at the cost of miserable living conditions of many others. This can be discussed along historical lines or along geographical regions or along other socioeconomic dimensions. If this is how you look at the problem, the climate problem, the solution relies not on a technological fix, but on the fight for greater climate justice. And this is our topic today. I want to start with the dimension of intergenerational justice and refer to some recent examples from Germany. We have seen over the past years the rise of a youth movement, as in many other countries, but maybe a bit more influential than in many places in the world. The Fridays for Future movement has mobilized huge political pressure in Germany exactly by pointing to the injustice that the generations who are now in positions of power and responsibility do not take sufficient action to really keep the Paris goals within reach, to limit global warming well below 2 degrees. And that the children and young people of today will suffer in their future from conditions created in the past without their fault, and the lack of action now, again without their fault, because they are not yet in the position to take decisions. Due to the demographics in Germany, the electoral system and the political representation is tilted towards the older generations. We just saw in the forefront of our general elections in September that the majority of the young voters were in favor of the Green Party. Polls have shown that again and again. But at the same time, it was also clear that the young generation, they were outnumbered by the older generations in the electorate, the older generations whose support for the Green Party was much weaker. I'm not talking in favor of the Green Party necessarily, but to point at an imbalance in the electorate due to the demographics. So the question is, how do you address this imbalance? In the course of the electoral campaign over this past summer in Germany, I have seen some interesting strategies to really align with older generations. For example, there have been activities or attempts to negotiate with one's own grandparents to vote not as they would normally have it, but in direct support of their grandchildren and in line with their political preferences. It was not really successful, but I found that a very interesting move to fight for climate justice, for intergenerational justice. Also, we have just come to a close with the negotiations of the future coalition between the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the Liberal Party. And I found it interesting in the context of our debate tonight that one decision was agreed on was to lower the voting age from 18 to 16, to shift the electoral demographics at least a little bit. One other point I would like to mention before I hand over to my colleagues is the Constitutional Court decision that we have witnessed earlier this year in Germany. Activists had issued constitutional complaints, which was decided upon in April this year. There, the Constitutional Court decided the current policy at national level was not clear enough on how to achieve the climate mitigation goals early enough. It was too much postponing and keeping the way towards achieving carbon neutrality too vague. And the court made it clear that by this, the government was placing too much burden on the shoulders of the younger generations. And I quote from the documentation of the official documentation of this court decision. The challenged provisions, the provisions here mean the laws, the policies, the challenged provisions do violate the freedoms of the complainants, some of whom are still very young. The provisions irreversibly offload major emission reduction burdens onto periods after 2030. These future obligations to reduce emissions have an impact on practically every type of freedom, because virtually all aspects of human life still involve the emission of greenhouse gases and are thus potentially threatened by drastic restrictions after 2030. Therefore, the legislator should have taken precautionary steps to mitigate these major burdens in order to safeguard the freedom guaranteed by fundamental rights, unquote. I found that really quite remarkable, and this has been commented as a landmark decision and has been interpreted as a decision that creates a framework of intergenerational justice. The government reacted to this in record time, probably also spurred by the approaching general election. So obviously this is not the solution to the climate problem. The new coalition has taken important steps forward, but the national policy as it is written down in the new coalition contract is still not in line with the Paris Agreement. But in my mind, it points to the changes that we need to strive for to change the decision landscape in a way that climate justice can be achieved, or that we can get closer to it. Having talked about intergenerational justice, I know that Reynaldo will bring in another dimension of climate justice, namely the perspective of indigenous people, and he will also look at another level of political power, namely the United Nations and the conferences of the parties. Reynaldo, how do you see indigenous people involved in the fight for climate change?
Thank you. My total grateful and welcome to all participants of this wonderful talk. The important aspect of the inclusion of indigenous peoples in the climate change conference is a vital reference for the different political forces that shape our world today. And I am very grateful for Consul General Akins to mention tribal nations and the part of indigenous peoples in the political formation of our nation states. In United States, we have 579 federally recognized indigenous and tribal nations. In years before, let's say a decade ago, we had much less. we had probably 14 or 15 less federally recognized indigenous nations, which means that in the last decade, more indigenous peoples and tribal nations have acquired formal recognition. And this is a process that is happening all across the world. Not only United States, the process of indigeneity and the legal history, the heavy legal history that indigenous peoples and nation states have, it became an emergent movement, political, social, environmental, moral, and in many cases, also social movements that have internal and external expressions within and outside of many contexts. The way in which I see specifically climate change in the reference of indigenous peoples dates back to the issues of colonialism and neocolonialism in our times, in the way in which certain issues have not been resolved. And by the time when colonialism started is also the date of when indigenous peoples were born. Before different forms of colonialism, they were nations, and after that, they became subject to new kinds of very complex relations in order to sustain their livelihoods, and they were in the middle of huge material and life losses and territorial losses, incredibly damaging of their opportunities to configure again their opportunities to be populations and societies and governance forms that have a past, present, and future. So their development has been very tied to the formation of nation states. And in my opinion, what we see today in climate change and the loss of biodiversity is part of the formation of nation states and the process of nation states of reformulate and reconstitute their forces and their alignment with the different groups, vulnerable groups that were left behind and were not active part of the development of nation states. In many cases, those vulnerable groups have become from victims to these extreme social forces of change in terms of expansion of capitalism and colonialism to nowadays major contributors of important environmental resources, natural resources, genetic resources, and knowledge systems that are now a powerful reference and a powerful source of solutions across the world. And this is really an appalling history in which indigenous peoples now became not only key constituents of the climate change conference, but in all United Nations arenas and conference and treaties and conventions, but also peoples that have a very skillful representation and that presented a very articulated fronts of negotiation. In the case of the climate change conference, we have the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And the inclusion of local communities was actually, according to the core group of the Indigenous Peoples Forum for Climate Change, an imposition from nation states due the lack of understanding of what local communities are in reality. Many of the local communities could be actually indigenous groups that are not recognized at all, that have no territories, but also there are religious-based groups, there are gender groups, there are NGOs, there are many groups from civil society that are included into the group of local communities. So our representation, I was part actually of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. I represented in parallel with my my participation from the Buffett Institute at Northwestern University, I participated also representing a Peruvian Amazonian Council of Nations, Shipibo, Conibo, and Setebo, which manages 3 million hectares of protected forests in Peru. And I've been representing them also at the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2018, and today at the new preparatory meetings for the next year meetings in China. So the issues that we face now is that the Indigenous Peoples Platform took the decision to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples and to separate and request the presidency to separate from local communities in order to promote and highlight the significance of the legal history that Indigenous peoples have, and in order that nation states enhance their understanding of their legal commitments, the legal obligations that they have with Indigenous peoples that are ratified by major treaties and conventions. Those are legal binding agreements, right? But there are also resolutions. There are lots of other non-enforcing mechanisms that nation states have been part of. So the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform reclaims an active participation as part of the solution of climate change. And the important inclusion of these solutions are on traditional knowledge. The Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform is an open and inclusive space that brings people and knowledge systems to build a climate resilience world for everyone. The Paris Agreement and the Decision 1 CP21 addresses climate change as a common concern of humanity, but also addresses the respective obligations of countries with the rights of Indigenous peoples, which has to be respected, promoted, and considered. The Conference of the Parties, also the Convention on Biological Diversity and Climate Change, which are very well connected, have recognized the need of strengthen knowledge, technologies, practices, and efforts of local communities and Indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change. In this context, the participation of Indigenous peoples was established for the exchange and experiences and sharing of best practices on mitigation and adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner. So the platform has been established successfully to strengthen the knowledge, technology, practices, and efforts of local communities and Indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change. So it's very important to understand that there are layers of these participation in the climate change conference. We had definitely a pavilion that was provided specifically for negotiations and outreach and activities. There was a wonderful facilitated working group prior to the starting of the conference, where delegates and representatives of all Indigenous nations across the world participated with equal voice. I was member of the facilitated working group, and we had also a caucus series of meetings and a dedicated space where we also invited many parties for informal conversations through the negotiations. I was also part of the negotiating team of Article 6. And from there, we had some major advances and challenges that I would like to discuss further during the next rounds of intervention. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll follow up on Reynaldo, and I really appreciate the way that Consul General Akins and Dr. Engels and Dr. Morales really tried to frame climate change as a problem of injustice, not simply a technical problem or sort of a more material kind of problem, but rather really thinking about the inevitability of injustice as the thing that has been driving climate change. And I wanted to just touch on a few points and make sure that we have time to interact with the audience and hear some questions. And I want to start from the perspective that often when we think about climate change, this crisis has created a sense of urgency that sometimes leads us to think that we don't have time for climate justice, right? That we simply need to take the actions necessary that are more technological and less political. But this, in fact, would exacerbate intersecting injustices that we see in climate change. And it's Dr. Engels talked about intergenerational justice. Dr. Morales talked a lot about both intergenerational and intragenerational justice. So that's the justice between humans and older than human beings that exist currently. And we can also think about the different dimensions of injustice that these different communities experience: distributive, procedural, and recognitional. And then there are these multiple forms of displacement that Consul General Akins was reflecting upon, such as economic injustice, cultural injustice, spiritual injustice, existential, political, and epistemic injustice. And then we can think about the scales, right? So there's local injustice, there's global injustice. So what do we do with all of this? How can we actually move forward when we're confronting what seems like an impossible journey? So I want to sort of suggest a way of thinking about climate justice as becoming the driver of how we make decisions and how we act. And I'd like to suggest that if we think about climate change and climate justice as a relationship that we as humans and older than human beings engage in, that we might be able to move beyond what has tended to be a transactional approach to climate change, that if I give you this, you give me that, right? And it becomes almost a zero-sum game. And we think more about the types of transformational relationships that we need. And the difference here is important. Transactional relationships are driven by self-interest, and this is how we've been pursuing climate governance for a long time. Transformational relationships are driven by shared commitments. And this is something that while nations, states can stand on a global platform and say that they have shared commitments, when you're looking behind the scenes, it's really more self-interest driven, right? It's really less about those shared commitments. So how do we move towards a place where we can actually have those transformational relationships that are driven by shared commitments? And what I want to sort of suggest, and I think the developments in Germany that Dr. Engels was talking about, as well as what Dr. Morales was talking about with regards to representation in climate governance, right? The political representation is being a place where we can start to think about how we set up the relational forms through which we make decisions about governing the climate. So there are a few different examples that I just want to draw on that shift the politics of representation towards more transformational relationships. And one of the most important things that we could be doing right now would be strengthening recognition of Indigenous land rights, as that could both help support climate mitigation and adaptation. But it's really remaining off the table for most nation states because it could shift the ways in which Indigenous needs and values and ideas are represented in national level dialogue. But this could be one of the single most important actions that we take. So if you're a student, if you're someone wondering, what do I do for climate change, for climate justice, advocating for the recognition of Indigenous land rights is one of the most important things that you could be doing. And even in a place like Germany, where you may not have the same kind of politics around Indigenous rights that we do in the United States, there are lots of ways in which the German government has been engaged around the world in projects related to forests and biodiversity and marine conservation that could be strengthened with attention to Indigenous rights. The other thing I wanted to mention is something that the Biden administration announced 2 weeks ago that is really committed to strengthening respect and recognition of treaty rights that were guaranteed to Native American nations when those nations were forced to cede their territories. And so this is one example of justice-driven climate action because it supports the sovereignty and strengthens adaptation and resilience in those Native nations by shifting the power relation towards those who are most invested in their own well-being. So one thing I'll just try to conclude with and move on is sort of promoting this recognition that nation states are not always representative of the beings found within our political borders. And that one thing that we should be trying to do is design processes that facilitate the types of representation that would move us towards transformational relationships, such as procedural principles that center the voices of those most vulnerable to climate change, or design principles that center the voices of those under or malrepresented in existing political structures. So I'll just conclude with suggesting that we can focus on strengthening these existential rights for humans and older than humans, and we can look to examples of the rights of nature, enshrining the rights of future generations, like the Constitutional Court decision Dr. Engels mentioned, and that if we really center these in our pursuits of climate change, rather than focusing on solely emissions reductions, we might be able to move towards something that looks like a more just future. So I'll kind of leave it there. I rushed through that because I wanted to make sure we have time for conversation.
So thank you very much. Dr. Engels, this is the part where we start the questions, I assume. The Q&A, or did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, we could go on and discussing among ourselves, of course, but I would find it more interesting to open up now, and I think we agree, the speakers, right?
That you can be asked anything. And while I'm waiting for some questions in the chat, I invite all of you to now is the time to engage, or type a Q and you can ask your question directly, of course. So listening to you, I think this is tremendously important, what you touched upon. And when I listen to you, Reynaldo, I'm realizing that being German, being born in Germany, of course, thinking about indigenous nations, I happen to have a doctorate in post-colonial studies, so I'm a little bit different maybe. But if I think of a lot of my peers, there's not much encounter, right, with indigenous people or indigenous rights. And then we're talking about, which I completely agree with Kim, we need to change policies, and we need to create a different awareness to actually come and bring upon change. But I'm also thinking at the same time, the things that are happening right now due to climate change affect people in different parts of the world simultaneously, sort of on the same level. I'm trying to get at, so apart from, yes, policy making, and we need to vote and voting rights, and that's great, but how can I bring together maybe people, let's say in the German disaster area of the Ahr Valley that had tremendous flooding this year, I think it was this year, in the beginning of the year, and let's say an indigenous nation or indigenous people that are confronted with changes and shifts in climate fundamentally on a much larger scale, probably, or more often, because I think there's a lot of learning from one another, practical learnings, actually. How do you deal with it and how do you encounter that? And I would be interested in that level, you know, what's underneath the policy making level, basically concrete for the people that seem to be so far removed from another, but just had probably the same experience.
Well, there is a real issue of the lack of knowledge from mainstream in Western academia about who the indigenous peoples are and what their political identity, the cultural, social, and different forms of identities that they have. What we mentioned in the case of federally recognized nations, indigenous nations, tribal nations in the United States, it's not the common landscape across the world. What we have is that in the global north, only the indigenous peoples that were colonized by the British monarchy were recognized as nations, and there were treaties signed with them. So we have the same case in United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, where treaties recognized them as nations and gave them recognized sovereignty over territories and ability and power to enact their own laws and their own constitutions. There was a process that the United States also have to change their constitutions many times to adapt to that. But in the meantime, also lots of these territories that were recognized were stripped out from the hands of indigenous peoples over time to give the pass to settler communities from Europe. But in the what we say like global South, there are other forms of political identities that indigenous peoples had, because Spaniard and Portuguese colonizers at the time did not sign any treaties. That was just really the norm that they had. They didn't sign any treaties with their colonized indigenous peoples. And only was recognized a tributary relationship as indigenous people. So many nations, and I am Peruvian American, for example. I was born in Peru. And in Peru, the indigenous peoples were recognized by the Spaniard viceroys as indigenous by different constitutions and from the colonial registry. But after 1969, the political denomination changed to campesinos. Campesinos is a Spaniard word for peasants. And 1969 was the first time when the word campesino was used to rebrand indigenous peoples into a new political identity as specifically agrarian producers, and to demote actually their political identities to just agrarian cooperatives. So in that same spirit, lots of different nations rebranded their indigenous peoples to campesinos and striped them out from their political rights and their political identity. And that's the issue that we have. These nations that became campesinos, cooperatives, and farmers have not developed any possible form of sovereignty, for example, and they are only can exercise very limited forms of self-determination and very limited forms of autonomy. And therefore, we have a very unequal landscape across the world about the participation of indigenous peoples as major contributors, or many limitations that exist for indigenous peoples to be considered contributors and active participants in sustainable development. And when we talk about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, one of the major challenges that we have across the world is that the peoples who have and have preserved territories and have preserved knowledge systems and have preserved natural resources for millennia are now the most vulnerable, and removing them from that relationship exposed the rest of the world to a major losses, because the peoples who were protecting forests, rivers, oceans, entire ecosystems, and knowledge systems that preserved that, and societies that were in direct correlation with nature, now are removed out of the picture, and for the rest of the world, they don't exist. So we're talking about climate change and many different policies. We're talking only about nations, corporations, and the citizens, but indigenous peoples are never considered part of that equation, and that's the real problem that we have. So now, how we understand these major forces of not only political but also social rights and knowledge and governance is a major challenge for our societies. There has been a very intentional attempt from educational systems to remove the history of indigenous peoples. I have a PhD in education as well as environmental sciences. So I know we really studied curriculums from all over the world. And we know that this has been a very established attempted colonial tool in order to reimagine the world without indigenous peoples, in the hope that someday they will assimilate. Well, guess what? The indigenous peoples have resisted and persisted in the preservation of their political identity, their governance systems, their cultural systems, their cultural and social capital, right? And in that way, they show a new roadmap in which societies can also understand themselves and imagine themselves outside of the corporate or the market-based mainstream society.
This is great, and I'm sorry for interrupting here at this point, because it's a very, very long answer that you're giving there. And this was precisely the question that I was asking. It's clear that there's an imbalance in power and that there's a colonial history and everything else. But looking forward, actually, I wanted to ask also Kim and Anita, where do you see where we can use this? What Reynaldo just explained, there is a wealth of knowledge on preservation for communities that are so removed seemingly removed from indigenous people, like somebody in the Ahr region in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. How is an indigenous knowledge of land preservation actually important for them, and how can future generations also benefit from that knowledge? If you can have a short answer on that, maybe that would be great, because we do have somebody in the audience that who wants to ask a question. Thank you.
I don't know if you wanted Reynaldo to tackle that first, or
No,
I can.
I want to see your
So
perspective
the only
on that
thing that I
one
would
as well.
say is that you cannot do act or use indigenous knowledge without the participation of indigenous peoples.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, one of the things I think is really interesting to, and this is what your question about knowledge, and I'll try to answer this very shortly. So another thing that the Biden administration did a couple of weeks ago is announced a need for federal agencies to incorporate indigenous knowledge into all federal decision making, which is incredible, right? This is a major shift in our scientific landscape here in the United States that I think will be hugely beneficial. And one of the ways that I see indigenous knowledge coming into science, if that's sort of the kind of your question is getting at, and how
people, society, like how if I sit in Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia, my house was washed away, right? There's clearly an impact, sorry for interrupting, it's climate change related, clearly. Right. Because we have done something wrong, and we have, on the other hand, a wealth of hundreds of years and thousands of years of different knowledge of how to preserve. But I don't want to interrupt you. Science, of course, is very important there as well. So please continue in that.
Well, I'm thinking about the ways in which people can benefit from indigenous ways of knowing in terms of how they understand what is happening to them and how they can move forward. And what this is looking like in some of the research that we're doing here in the United States with tribes is really thinking about viewing, approaching the way that we live in a much more holistic way, so that we see that, you know, the flooding of our homes is not simply an engineering problem. It's not simply something that can just be fixed if we put in more levees or if we put in seawalls, but rather that we need to fundamentally rethink where we sit in relation to all the other beings in the world, right? And so that means humans, more than humans, older than human beings, plants, even our atmosphere. And so I think that's how we can start to shift away from these really technocentric and economic-centered approaches and think towards relational approaches. How do we re-center ourselves in relation to the world around us and stop siloing ourselves off from each other? I guess, I don't know if that gets to your question, but that's sort of how I think about it. And it's something that, like in the National Science Foundation, when they fund research, they don't value that, right? Some programs do, but this requirement to recognize that other way of knowing that the Biden administration has recently announced is incredibly, it could help move communities towards that kind of thinking.
Thank you so much. Anita, if it's okay, I'm gonna go with the questions really quickly. So there's one question from Courtney. Courtney, if you wanna ask a question directly, please do so.
Yes, thank you. Courtney Pelzer-Hönecke from Universität Hamburg. I'm head of international affairs, and thank you very much to all the panelists. It's been very eye-opening and enlightening. Coming from the United States and living in Germany, and coming from a background from a hometown beset by poverty, I wanted to kind of focus on the economical aspect of climate justice and methods of creating climate change. I feel quite often that you know, regulations or suggestions for working towards a better climate or working towards climate change come from an area of privilege, and a question if we're really looking at or how to address people who are not privileged when we talk about climate change. I mean, if we take something that perhaps seems rather banal, such as fast fashion, it's a very, to be quite honest, a very privileged thing to say, oh, nobody should be shopping for fast fashion or the like, because we're completely ignoring the economical aspect and effects of such things. So I kind of wanted to hear what the panelists' viewpoint on how we can better approach the economical aspect or the economic disparity when discussing climate justice and climate reform.
Maybe I can jump in here for a moment. I find all these questions very fascinating. And Courtney, thank you for also bringing this up. We have worked a lot on within Germany on how to link the climate topic to different strata of society, groups with different socioeconomic backgrounds. And predominantly, people have been asking the question, well, of course, climate mitigation, that will raise the cost. So we will have to talk about climate justice with relation to lower income groups and the households that are in a precarious state of economic well-being and so on. And I also, I will come to that, but I also want to point out that justice, you cannot ask the justice question just at the lower end of the spectrum, right? What we see at the moment is a growing concern about very high CO2 emitting luxury lifestyles, with many cars, many air travels, space travel. This will probably grow in the next 2 or 3 years. And this has reached a level of personal carbon footprint that is really making a difference. And also the symbolic imbalance that is inherent in that. So we are looking for ways of how to address this injustice question at both ends. But I've been working with others on the question how to, find ways to compensate big losses or disproportionate losses, economic losses, and low-income households, because many of the climate policies will induce higher energy costs and so on. But what I would like to shift the attention to is that I think we need to identify many groups that can be made into an owner of climate policies, that they detect how climate mitigation can really be a benefit for them. For example, through the creation of new business opportunities, or for a region that has been forced to abandon coal extraction. We need to find new regional identities and, to find positive ways of identifying with climate mitigation, and also developing actorhood and ownership of this. So that's how we are discussing that at the moment. And I also wanted to link to what Kim said in the first round about land rights. Of course, we see that also in Germany, the way that land rights are organized, are legally available, that influences heavily, who is able to really support the transformation. And maybe that was not just exactly to your question, but I wanted to contribute with these points to the discussion.
Thank you so much. And I see that, I know Sina has a question, but I want to go to Mimi first because she put a Q in the chat to ask a personal question. Then I'm going to go through the ones that are typed in the chat. So Mimi, please go ahead. Or maybe not. Okay, then I'm just gonna go.
No,
no, I got it.
You got it. Fantastic.
By now. My apologies.
So
I'm Mimi Katz in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York. So one of the comments that somebody made early on that I hadn't thought about before was the climate injustice aspect of the underrepresentation of youth in politics and positions of power. And the first thing I thought of was what my parents taught me from when I was a little kid. It was that your power is in your vote. So I quickly Googled that. And I'm just going to read a couple of statistics because I know we're short on time. But in the US in 2020, 18 to 29-year-olds, 50% of qualified voters voted, which was a whopping 11% above the previous presidential election. And then in comparison, from 65 to 74 age, it was 76%. And then I looked at Germany. You're doing better with up to 24-year-olds voted at the rate of 57%, but the general percentage was 61.4%. So really, it's probably a rhetorical question, but if youth is underrepresented and not in positions of power, like why aren't they voting at higher rates, and how do we get them to vote?
Oh, that is a rhetorical. No,
yeah, it is. I don't really expect
I mean, it's,
but
you know,
what do you do?
I think, you know, this is something, as a former grassroots organizer, you know, that was one of my first jobs was a grassroots organizer and trying to get out the vote. And it's extraordinarily frustrating. At least in the United States, people have very little faith in the system, right? And we emphasize the federal government much more over local and state government. And I wonder to what extent a focus on more local government and state level government could actually mobilize people more, because you're in much closer proximity to decision makers at those levels and could, you know, really affect policies that impact your life every day, right? And I go to the city council meetings here in Evanston. They've been online for a while now, but not that many people go, right? But they make consequential decisions that shape our lives, and they're doing climate action at that level. And so perhaps one thing we need to really think about is how do we build a greater emphasis on those more local level elections to get the youth out, because I have family members that don't vote because they say, why? What's the point? You know, and we see the gerrymandering happening right now. It really is disenfranchising. And so, you know, short of a political revolution, which I'm not advocating for, but we've got to figure out a different way of connecting youth with decision makers.
Yeah, I think in Germany we have an interesting divide in the young people. Some are really getting more rebellious, more revolutionary, twisting or developing towards adopting civil disobedience, and, you know, just becoming more radical on climate and other environmental topics. And of course, others are really detached from politics. I would love to, explain this by the long COVID silence, that everyone has kind of been muted and turned down, but I know that's not an explanation that's really valid. Yeah, I don't know. We try to really make things more interesting, and I think the schools have a very important function here. In many of the schools, and I'm talking about higher level schools, but in those schools, in many of them, you learn early on how to create your own business. No? And I think it would be at least as important to learn how to create your own NGO, how to organize a petition, how to really organize, as Kim said, these local level administrations. It's so important, the decisions that are taken there, and nobody knows about that level of political decision making. So I think the schools have a great role there, potentially.
I would like to say that I see a great risk on the way in which we explore some solutions with the marginalization or the exclusion of certain groups. And I would like to go back to how these issue from the last 300 years on the formation of nation states tried specifically to remove indigenous peoples from being major contributors or participants of any forms of development. Now that we have today is the difference between who are the stakeholders, and nation states and stakeholders and civil societies are the only ones who are part of these negotiations. And it is not true. Indigenous peoples are not a stakeholder, and they are dependent nations. Depending on nation states, of course. But the main and key distinction is that they are rights holders, which is a very distinctive political identity. And in the case of United States, you have, for example, the Congress, well, the presidency, and you have the judicial system, but you also have the tribal nations. And there is a Congress of American Indian Nations that participate also as another branch of government. And we had members of the Congress of American Indians participating also at the local communities and indigenous peoples platforms, the climate change conference. The issue of the use of traditional knowledge systems in any forms of development, including climate change or biodiversity laws, or all the problems addressed by the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, must to include indigenous peoples as contributors, and their knowledge systems is not divorced from their own participation. And in the past, what we consider traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge has been used by major sustainable development agencies and development aid in the third world countries or developing countries, and in the way in which they extracted and appropriated their knowledge and their resources conveniently in order to merge them with science. And it was a very messy process, and it never worked because the indigenous peoples were not included, and their governance systems were not included as well. And they cannot be in any way participate equally as contributors. Many of the aspects of traditional knowledge, when they were applied to development projects, were just used as convenient pieces to mix with science. And it never worked because indigenous peoples were not completely engaged into that process. And at the time of implementation of those projects, indigenous peoples and local communities were not participating in their full will. So what we have that after a couple of decades of heavy investment of development, and what it became sustainable development, is that a waste of billions of dollars because of the divorce between the practices of inclusion with a real and effective way in which indigenous peoples and their knowledge systems and their resources are included in the equation. So what we have seen, I see questions from about Chile, for example. What is happening in Chile is a very interesting phenomenon. Chile has been one of the most conservative countries in Latin America, right? And after the ousting of Allende, who was a socialist president, somehow, after a full decade of dictatorships and very conservative movements and a very militarized society, the Chilean society has emerged in a completely different world, and now the Mapuche peoples are leading now the commission for the new constitution, constitutional reform. Peru, for example, has a new indigenous president, but he has not the same luck that the Chilean society had, because in Peru, then the Congress is blocking all opportunities for a new constitutional reform or a new constitution. Also, we have the same issues in Chile, where President Bolsonaro also represents and is being considered by indigenous people as a major threat of existential threat. And we have the same situation all across the world. In Northern Europe, the Sami nations, for example, it's a very powerful reference of governance in European nations. And they have also adopted very important platforms of negotiation of their rights, and they conquered lots of important rights in terms of territorial rights, water rights, fishing, hunting, the use of their natural resources. So we're present in many different issues, but the most clear aspect that the people need to understand, in academics and researchers, is that, and politicians as well, is that indigenous peoples are not divorced from their knowledge systems, and they're not divorced also from their environments and the natural systems that they preserve over millennia. Those ecosystems that we see that are pristine and wild ecosystems were really very careful managed ecosystems for millennia, and were taken and appropriated in very many different many ways, violent ways. But now, in this process of reformation of nation states, we are all understanding and trying to see the future with a more proactive and positive ways in which we can heal the wounds of the past and include people who were previously marginalized in more effective ways, from the understanding of their nature, from the understanding of their social, political, and cultural nature and identities. And that's the major challenge that we have. If we continue thinking that this is only a matter of science or technology or financial mechanisms or money, I think we will run in the same vicious circle. So I would like to invite the audience and my colleagues to see in which ways different actors and different key stakeholders and right holders can be included into the solutions that we think for the whole world.
I think this is beautiful, Reynaldo. This is a fantastic ending to this this conversation. I wish we had another hour, of course, because this is a topic that actually needs a lot more time. And I think what you said is just very important. And I'm sorry that I'm not getting to the last two questions, but they can be summed up in a way also, because they both were asking in a way of the new narrative. And I think that's what you were all talking about as well. We need a different and a new narrative for the future, a more balanced narrative, a narrative that includes old technology, new technology, and then how it influences policy making. We were talking about personal interests and shared commitments. I think this is something that everybody can work with. What are the personal interests? What are the interests? How can we balance them? And then how can we formulate a shared commitment out of that and also act on a shared commitment? So I hope that I'm not leaving anything out that is substantial, but I wanted to thank you once again. I want a big thank you to Hamburg, big thank you to the university there, and also to the Consulate General, of course, a big thank you to Northwestern, and of course to our audience. We do have another event on climate. We have an event on land use and climate in Africa, going a little bit further south this time. And I would like to invite you to join us also next week for that one. Check out our website and you can find all the information there and also how to sign up for it. So with that, I thank you, wish you a wonderful evening in Germany, a fantastic afternoon in the United States. Come and see us again. Thank you, Jan. I'm looking forward to the next collaboration. I think we should definitely follow up on this discussion for sure. We should have a part number 2. Thank you and see you next time.